Hello, everybody. So if Charity's slides got a C minus, then mine are definitely a fail, and particularly because I got the date wrong. Didn't even get the date right, so there we go. Anyway, ignore the slides. All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for being here. It's great to be here. What a fantastic conference. I'm really looking forward to the whole thing. I'm Tim Nicholas. I'm going to talk to you a bit about how I approach my role as a principal engineer. I'm going to give a brief introduction, my sort of path to LFI. I'll touch on the sort of initial focus that I had in this role and some of the consequences from the incident review and investigation work that I did, and then how I now seek to influence systemic change and improve site operations in different ways than I might have otherwise. I'll touch on how I try and support decision-making above me in the organization and various forms of advocacy and reframing. And I'll touch on how incidents act as a reference point for me for everything that I do, even if it's actually quite far from the sharp end in terms of particular task or activity. Hopefully it'll highlight some ways that involvement in incident investigation, along with the research and scholarship of resilience engineering and other related fields, can inform a bunch of non-incident work as well as the incident work. So yeah, I've been working in tech since 1999-ish. I've been a system administrator in various forms. I've been a team lead, a product owner, an architect, but I've always been focused on platforms and on infrastructure and on operations. And I'm now principal engineer as part of a central SRE enablement type team that provides tooling and processes and training and incident response support. And we do that for a range of engineering teams who themselves deliver and support both customer and internal platform type capabilities. In 2018, I was working as a platform architect, and I was in a position to choose pretty freely how I spent my time to deliver some value. And so I started looking at how we were doing post-mortems, how we were trying to make things better after incidents. And it pretty quickly became clear that our blameless post-mortems weren't terribly satisfying. We sort of knew that they should be blameless, but we hadn't developed any of the skills to do that. We didn't really know how. And so as a result, we simply avoided talking about the most important things, what people actually did. And instead focused on the purely technical and mechanistic elements, because they felt safer. We knew how to do that, and we felt like we weren't blaming anyone if we sort of contained things to that space. And so along with a group of collaborators, or perhaps co-conspirators, I started to read and research and started to experiment with running better post-mortem sessions. And for me and for those of us in that group, the ITSE debrief guide was really our initial Bible. But as I started to read more of the sources that it referenced and the online blogs that referenced it, my eyes opened to a whole new world that's led me here. But I remember thinking, wow, there's actually evidence. There's research. They've learned from other industries, which seemed like an astonishing outlier in tech process type things, to me at least. So it was an exciting time. We didn't actually have a huge amount of pre-existing process and structure to get in the way of or to conflict with. So we were able to experiment. We were able to try things, and we did. My colleague Perman is going to be telling this story in more depth and more breadth tomorrow, so absolutely do check that out. For me, in 2019, I kind of had an opportunity, shall we say, to stop and reflect and think about what I wanted to do professionally. And I came to the conclusion that I didn't really want to return to doing product management or architecture type work, but the post-incident learning things that I'd been doing and been learning about were both really important and really interesting and would benefit from my years of technical experience and my experience in doing those different kinds of roles, like a bit of product management and those things. The diversity of the disciplines that I dabbled in would contribute to that as well. So that realization, along with the great people that I've been working with and the environment that supported the experimentation that I knew would be required, would be really valuable, led me back to the same organization, but with a different role, one that was more squarely aligned with improvement of operational practices, with enhancing expertise, and with those post-incident processes. And so that's the role I have now, principal engineer for site reliability. And from the start of this role, I was really focused on enhancing resilience and particularly frontline expertise. I took the perspective that enabling effective learning was the core function of the post-incident activity, and that by improving the expertise of engineers, systemic improvement would follow. I still think that. We'd be better able to respond to incidents, we'd make engineering decisions that would produce less surprising results. It'd be good for engineers, it'd be good for the organization, it'd be good for customers. And thankfully, we found that that was true, as expected. There's a great deal of value from that work. It continues to be. Engineers reported learning things. We heard gratitude that their perspectives could be heard. Relationships were enhanced and people were able to coordinate better. There's going to be a lot of talk at this conference, I'm sure, about sort of practices of post-incident learning, and I'm going to just focus on a couple that were particularly relevant to me and to how my work has changed. The first is the one-on-one interviews. Have been mentioned already. These provide for me the most detailed view of any one perspective on the incident or things that have happened. These are relatively deep interviews where you're trying to talk to someone who is involved or has got some specialist perspective, and they're really, really useful. And they're very frequently a source of disconfirming information, and that helps investigations to go deeper. They're often where you go, oh, there's that whole other dimension that didn't come through in Slack, it didn't show up in other ways, and can open up other lines of inquiry. The second thing is just extending the timescales, and we saw this a little bit in Nora's two stories, where one had a very narrow view and one spanned back in time. But I think it can go back a lot further than that sometimes and be very useful. So allowing the scope of a review or an investigation to extend back in time as far as it needs to go. The context around an incident is so often missing important information if it excludes events that happened much earlier. Those might be personnel changes or structure changes, might be a long abandoned priority that shaped why the system looks the way it is and why it functions the way it is and who knows what. So extending back to that's really useful. So I mentioned those two because they are, in my experience, really important influences on the sort of type and scale of the insights that can be generated from incident reviews. And they contributed a lot to me quickly finding that my mental models of the system were growing and being refined in ways that were perhaps quite different from the models that were being built by normal sort of review participants, in addition to what they were learning. And so as an individual doing some of our deeper incident investigations, directly analyzing incident communications, conducting one-on-one interviews, pulling together all these multiple perspectives, I was exposed to much more detail and able to make sense of much more detail. I was spending a lot of time with this. And because my role was not scoped to a particular technical slice within the organization, it provided an opportunity to identify and to articulate patterns that may not have been evident more locally, or that could be mischaracterized as arising from local decision-making when actually they were part of some bigger pattern. And that gave me fresh insights into systemic challenges and constraints. As the great and dearly missed Richard Cook, without whom we wouldn't be here, said in his paper 2 years before the mast, learning about how to learn about patient safety. Learning about safety exposes organizational stress. Virtually all components of the new look expose the underlying rifts, disagreements, and mixed character of the organization itself. This threatens some and makes many uncomfortable, but these conflicts are central to learning about safety because they're the sources of conflicting demands and resource limitations that constrain practitioners' and management's ability to create safety. So with that in mind, it's really unsurprising that systemic pressures were made visible in the patterns of trade-off decisions that we saw. And it's unsurprising that it became clearer to me and others because we were doing this work. And so over time, that's driven a shift in emphasis for me in my non-incident work towards those organizational stresses. I started to think more about how to influence the environment of operational decisions, the trade-offs that were being made, but the environment within which those decisions were being made. My objective became not simply to improve the quality of judgments that were made within a fixed trade space, but to change the trade space to ensure that better options were actually available to those frontline workers. Everyone's making trade-off decisions at all layers of the organization. So another way of looking at this is that each trade space is the product of trade-off decisions made at some other layer or a combination of other layers. The possibilities at the bottom are constrained if we don't also support learning and expertise at the layers above. But of course, it's got to be acknowledged that making changes to upstream trade-offs with the intention of shifting the pressures and the constraints, this is hard, and it can be slow, but it's also necessary. But we're talking about multi-layered, complex systems, interdependencies and emergent behaviors. And so in that context, intervening is really fraught with difficulty and unintended consequences. On the other hand, not intervening is fraught with difficulty and unintended consequences. And so the positive here, though, is that small and frequent adjustments are possible, and they're easier, and they're safer. I'm personally a big supporter of the idea that actually systemic improvement seldom depends on a well-defined end state. In fact, focusing on an imagined end state can be counterproductive, and it encourages sort of bigger, more dangerous steps, shortcuts. And it's more imagined. And so we don't really know whether we can take a path to get to that place. Instead, system improvement should, in my view, be focused on the direction of travel and the ability to make progress from where we are. Grow to where you're going, as Jessica Kerr said in her 2020 Yale talk. Well worth watching. So to do that, it really helps to know what pressures or forces or constraints you're hoping to see strengthen and which you're hoping to see weaken, which is really different than thinking about what is it that we want the system to look like in some imagined utopian future. And the feedback loop from incidents plays obviously a super important role. Beyond simply identifying the need for change and the options for change, incident analysis also functions to enable earlier course correction, more frequent. So what does this look like for me? How do I sort of seek to influence that trade space from my role as a principal engineer? How do I use those insights from incident learning to do that? One form that it takes is upward-facing decision support for my leadership. So this is with the aim of helping them be informed when they make decisions that will impact the pressures and constraints that we see being consequential in incidents. Leadership are making decisions that relate to what we aim to achieve and also, importantly, how we allocate resources. So the quality of those decisions really matters, and they can't be done if you don't know where we're at risk of saturation and other challenges. Those decisions often have also really long delays between decision and eventual consequence, positive and negative, which makes reflection and learning on those decisions really hard for an individual who's making those decisions, and then sometime later something happens and it's influenced by that and many other things. So decision support can be helpful. It can be as simple as simply providing additional perspective as required. But perhaps most relevantly for this conference and the sorts of people who are here, decision support is also a sort of core function of cross-incident analysis and theme identification. And that's true whether it's formal or whether it's informal, whether it's based on some sort of rigorous qualitative analysis process across a big quorum of well-written documents, or whether it's based on integration of a whole bunch of incidents that happens in the minds of some people who are involved in it over a long period of time and build up a sense of what's important in that. Both can be valuable. Integrating the experiences and the findings of tens or hundreds or thousands of incidents is really hard, specialized work. And providing the output of that integration with some form of interpretation is really pretty important and pretty vital to helping that become valuable at those higher levels of an organization. In addition to sort of directly thinking about leadership decisions, I also try and help people navigate complexity and be able to make better decisions by carefully considering how problems and situations are framed, and by advocating for people doing operational work. And there's a lot of crossover between those things. Putting challenges, opportunities, events into useful context and useful language that is actually open to further inquiry and to sense-making can be really powerful. It's basically what the whole blameless thing was, right? How do we think about this situation, this activity that we're doing in a different way and unlock progress? So reframing can also be really relatively light touch, but high leverage, particularly over longer timeframes, and change how an organization or a group of people that make up an organization think about things. It might be hearing demands for greater autonomy, but moving the conversation towards focus on supporting expressions of initiative. Or it might be finding ways to talk about the work that is being done when other people are seeking to talk about the work that isn't being done. As a senior non-manager with long tenure in the organization and working in SRE, I consider myself to have a pretty, sort of a duty to advocate for engineers doing operational work whenever I can. And that can mean simply representing the sort of operational reality in a smaller group with a focused piece of work. And an example of that is, I recently had a chance to contribute to the review of an emergency change policy and some of the associated tooling. And by centering the conversation there around the experience of engineers responding to high urgency, high stress, high uncertainty incidents, we were able to discuss when maybe otherwise good engineering judgments might be in conflict with policy and be made to appear bad. And that helped us more easily distinguish between what were the policy concerns and what were just practice concerns. Just what needed to be really adaptable, what didn't. We could discuss the different potential impacts of asking for, in terms of a cross-check, of asking for someone to review, or asking someone to approve, or asking for someone to acknowledge. What did that change in the cognitive landscape of a stressful incident? How did that change the pressures on someone being asked to do that and the work that they had to do? And so this allowed for the drafting of lighter weight policy, which I hope is going to pay dividends over the long period of time and allow for practices to evolve and improve without having to navigate around too many hard lines that are hard to change. Advocacy can also mean sort of firmly holding a pretty contrasting position longer term, despite organizational pressures. An example of this was a long series of conversations at varying levels of intensity relating to the systemization of MTTR. We were actually able to successfully push back on that work by consistently representing our perspective that the harm we could anticipate when shallow incident metrics were inevitably interpreted in natural but mistaken ways, and by helping other people understand how little could be accurately inferred from those actual measures. We highlighted the context and the insights that were gained by engineering managers who actively gathered that data from the systems that their engineers used, and how that context is missing if the same measures are mechanized and standardized despite implementation diversity. And pleasingly, we now see other people, including senior managers, independently counsel caution with regard to interpretation of shallow incident metrics, incident counts, et cetera, which is, of course, fantastic to see. Alternatively, advocacy can mean visibly presenting a pretty challenging perspective in order to make and hold space for others. Sometimes you think someone should say something, and then you realize that you are someone. A couple of years ago, we had a period of instability which prompted a public apology and a sudden change freeze. And it was a pretty challenging time. And I sought to, in that situation, to reframe the situation at an organization level to enhance everyone's understanding of the pressures that were faced by engineers. This was with the goal of enabling empathy, reflection, and promoting shared problem solving across role and organizational boundaries. Doing that, and doing it early, made space for others to share their perspectives, and it precipitated some really valuable discussions. But those sorts of communications, especially in sort of all company type forums, at times of really heightened emotion and sensitivity, can call on a fair bit of boldness, even from someone with significant seniority and tenure. But it really helps to be supported by a wide experience base and to have confidence that the perspectives that you're representing are of something wider than yourself. And close involvement with incident analysis provided me with that assurance. Which brings me to my final point, which in a way is just closing the loop. So first, incident investigations enable insight into how the system's functioning at a range of different levels. And then those insights enable interventions to improve the system. And then further incident investigation functions to support and refine those interventions over time by updating our view of how the system's functioning. This is a continuous process that supports and reinforces itself. It's not you do one and then you do the other. We're constantly looking at the system through the lens of incidents. And for me, as a principal engineer, it's very important that I'm able to keep doing incident investigation work because it enables observation of the messy reality with a minimum level of abstraction. That constant connection and updating of my mental models is really key to all the other work that I do. But it's important to note that it's not possible for many other roles to replicate that, especially not with sort of the wide scope across the organization and the different systems, and the different teams, and the way that they link together over long periods of time. And that's what makes it really important. It's what makes this work important, is that it's really hard for most other roles to be able to get that kind of perspective. And so they need the analysis and the integration of those things that can be provided by people who focus on it with a lot of their time. So to wrap up a little, learning from incidents along with the research in resilience engineering and associated fields has really seeped into everything that I do. It exposes stress points and highlights opportunity for improvement that can sometimes appear pretty far from the incidents themselves. The actions that insights prompt can often be pretty gentle and can be insertions of information and perspective. They're not necessarily major initiatives and dramatic change. And the continuous inspection of operational work in the form of incident investigations provides the critical feedback to how that's all going, because it's feedback on the system as it actually exists and as it actually operates. So I hope here that I've provided a little bit of a different story about how incident analysis can contribute to systemic improvement and how it can influence how we go about doing our work, even if it's pretty far from incident response. I also hope that I've added a little bit to the conversation about how valuable it can be to have senior engineering staff, especially with a wide remit across organizational scope, deeply involved in incident review, activity, and investigation. Thank you.